It's time for the Bible. We don't really know for sure what it is and what it's not. Holy Ghost, God, baby, God blasted on the spot. Ghost. Friends, it's time for the Bible.
Hello, it's Robert M. Price, the Bible Geek, with a special episode called The Barton Geek, because, as you know, our good friend Dr. Barton, pseudonym though he is, frequently shares interesting hypotheses and readings and conjectures with us, and I, for one, am always happy to steal his stuff and put my name on it. Well, not quite. I do actually give him credit. But since I happen to have a whole bunch of them, I figured if we can have the Reuven Geek, we can have the Barton Geek. So, on the way with the Barton Geek, though before I forget to mention it again, I did want to remind you to tune in to Gary Stevens' podcast, The History in the Bible, which has to do with what leads into the radical criticism, a.k.a. minimalism, of the Old Testament, and that's the series of 20-minute bites he's podcasting now, and then he'll follow it up in a few weeks with a New Testament version. Interesting stuff. Take a listen. Gary Stevens, Garry, Stevens, Stevens, and The History in the Bible. So give it a listen. And so on to the Barton Geek. First, was David a historical figure? There's no independent attestation of the existence of Dave or of his kingdom, either within or without ancient Israel, except the mentions of him in the Tanakh, the Old Testament. Interestingly, the largest chunk of evidence, quote-unquote, of his existence within the Tanakh are the Psalms attributed to him, yet most scholars consider these attestations to be fictional. Personally, whether David was historical or fictional doesn't matter much to me. On the other hand, I had an interesting theory about a possible historical David. What might it mean if a few of the Psalms, royal ceremonial prayers that they were attributed to a historical David? We know that the Tanakhic tales of David attributed musical talents to him. Suppose that was true. I'd like to propose a theory that whatever else the historical David was, he was a musician, one who actually created enough royal or ceremonial prayers that he was initially remembered for that bit of divine inspiration. From there, the Psalms survived through the royal cult, and the temple did not. Later writers, reading through the Psalms for inspiration to construct the Tanakh as we know it today, suddenly realized that no mere mortal songwriter could have written such inspired prayers. Those could have come only from one to whom God himself spoke. Nowhere was the historical David remembered as a prophet, even though there seemed to have been a class of musically stimulated prophets. They were dismissed with the Korah story. The only other type of person to whom God spoke was one of his adopted sons, a king of Israel. Psalm 2, I will tell of the decree of Yahweh. He has said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Therefore, David must have been a forgotten king of Israel. Dr. Barton isn't saying that. He's saying that's the process of inference leading to a belief in a historical David, right? More than that, because he was so influential in creating psalms, more and more being attributed to him as time went by, he must have been a great king. Thus, one theory of the historical David is that he was a great psalmist, who was later elevated to great king status by the reconstruction of the Tanakh. Reconstructors of the Tanakh. Let's see. And what do you think of that? It's interesting. It's similar to the belief that the story of Jesus was constructed from Old Testament hints that were read in an esoteric way, much like the later Kabbalah. to spin out stories of a Messiah who had already come but in secret. And that's very similar, again, to the spurious life of Muhammad from the Hadith that arose as attempts to explain various surahs of the Quran from internal clues, always riveting them to the fictional or at least legendary character of Muhammad. So this kind of argument is, if it helps to consider it, I guess what I'm saying is it's methodologically similar to other theories that do make some sense, and this one might. But one qualm I have with it is that it's not clear to me why you would go from inspired psalmist to king. Now, I know you've said, well, kings were spoken to by God, but generally speaking, not much, right? They would, if the stories are any indication, then Gad the seer and Nathan the prophet and these guys would come in with messages for the king, but they didn't necessarily hear it. Even when it says God said to him, look, you've sinned big time, I'm going to give you 3 choices, all of them bad, pick which punishment you want. We have to assume that those were delivered by oracles, since often they're actually shown to do such things for the king. And you mentioned the inspired singers, the musical prophets. This was a big thing in ancient Israel and Judah. Cult prophets, as they're called. Aubrey Johnson has written a couple of good comprehensive books on this phenomenon, and others in their wake. So it seems to me the crucial jump here from inspired psalmist to king is a little far to leap. I don't know. It could be true. It's worth pursuing, but I would have that hesitation about it. Well, another Bartonian bulletin. In working on my grimoire, I've been reading through various forbidden practices in the Tanakh. I've had a lot of difficulty with the divination practices, since some seem to be allowed and some not. Trying to figure out why in these instances has proven interesting. One of those practices is astrology. I've tended to regard this as forbidden because it was an attempt to discern the will of the gods without directly asking. Thanks to listening to you, I'm a little more dubious about that assumption. One can separate divinatory practices into 2 main camps, signs and meditations. In signs divination, one shakes the runes, reads the definition of the tarot cards, consults the dream dictionary, welds the different signs into a single narrative, and that's pretty much that, by the book. In meditation divination, such as stone reading, Urim and Thummim, peering into water bowls and crystal balls, listening to the rustling of leaves, communing with spirit in dreams, or dream incubation. Of course, these are all mentioned in the Bible, right? The diviner uses the object of divination as a focus or medium of communing with spirits, and doesn't so much read the signs, but listens to the messages conveyed by the spirits involved. Obviously, there can be considerable overlap. By the way, one of the visions that really fits here is when Daniel sees the disembodied hand tracing on the wall of Belshazzar's feasting hall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. What the heck? And he says, well, it means you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Well, he doesn't mean that he's translating the Hebrew or some other, or Elamite or something. It doesn't. It's like glossolalia. In fact, that's exactly what it is, just in written form. And he must interpret it like an utterance of tongues is interpreted. So yeah, that would be a meditative one in your category. Pretty interesting. Okay, I would like to offer the suggestion that the forbidden astrology may not have been the type of book astrology that we think of today. It was not signs astrology, that is, looking at the position of the stars, comets, or meteors, then consulting a book. That was an issue, but the real forbidden nature of astrology was that the stars were seen as angels or the abodes of angels. Or gods, perhaps. Meditative astrology would essentially have been consulting with angels for knowledge not provided on God's orders. Thus, it fit more in the category of angelology than what we would think of as astrology. The Book of Enoch, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I still think the prohibition against Malakoi in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, would seem to point to a continued orthodox belief that only bad things came of interacting with angels not sent directly by God. One that I might point out continues to this day, like the medieval grimoires, Key of Solomon and stuff like that, employed the conjuration of angels to do your bidding, right? Not God. Let's see. Of course, these categories tend to mutate with time, so it eventually came to include both signs and meditation astrology, but the origins may lie with communion with angels. Thoughts? Well, that does kind of make you think of the worship of angels that is prohibited in Colossians. It's real late in the day for the Bible, but that probably, I think, it means the same thing as it does in Galatians, where keeping the commandments of the Torah is the worship of angels, since angels gave these laws, the elemental spirits, the archons, the principalities and powers. So though you think like the Sukikoi that you're worshiping God, the lawgiver, in fact you've been duped into worshiping the demiurge and his henchmen. So I don't know if that really is divination. You could be right. I mean, we do read that the worship of the hosts of heaven was forbidden. The stars, right, presumed to be gods, one suspects, and that this was an import from Assyria, which is why when Josiah decided to declare his independence from Assyria, big mistake it turned out, he kicked the worship of the hosts of heaven out of the temple. But then again, the whole Deuteronomy 32 thing, where God, where El Elyon divides up the human race, so that every one of the sons of El will have a nation to rule and to be worshipped by. That's getting sort of close to the idea of Israelite polytheism, and you wonder if the hosts of whom Yahweh was the Lord refers already in a Jewish context to the starry hosts, armies of heaven. Even in Luke they call them that, the heavenly host, the heavenly army. And so that would tend to back up what you're saying, though it's not absolutely clear. There's some pieces of that puzzle missing, but that might be a good way to put those puzzle pieces together. Could be. Also, keep in mind that the state would have an interest in governing the means of divination or revelation, which is to say the same thing, I think. And as Frank Kermode points out in a great essay, that's also the point of defining a canon of Scripture, revelatory texts that teach you doctrines. Well, if there's some doctrines we don't like, and we know they're promulgated in certain documents, they're not going in the canon. We don't want you reading that kind of stuff. Same issue. So it seems to me like, the story of Saul and the Witch of Endor. I think it was Shirley MacLaine, wasn't it? He's trying to get the scoop from the Almighty as to how the battle with the Philistines is going to go the next day, but he gets nothing. No prophet can answer him. The ephod, which was an oracular breastplate that the priest wore, the Urim and Thummim, they were all considered legitimate, but he was, nobody was picking up on the other end. So he then seeks out black market revelation, right? He himself has outlawed certain of these divinatory means, such as spirit mediums, and people that, like today, will conjure up the dead, supposedly. And so he has to go in disguise, since he's painted himself into a corner here. Why did he ban that, by the way? Well, in terms of the narrative, who knows, really, but it would make sense if we're to... It would make a whole lot of sense if Samuel had told him to do it, to ban these things. And why would Samuel care? Because he was a prophet, a seer, not like Isaiah, but like Elijah, a traveling miracle worker and charismatic. He wants to be heeded, right? He knows what's happened to the oxen that Saul was looking for and stuff like that, right? So he doesn't want the competition from spirit mediums because he would get his information from probably from the, on the analogy with the Arabic kahins, soothsayers. He would have gotten his revelations from the spirits of the desert or whatever. Well, he doesn't want people going off and paying the mediums of dead people. Right? That's an alternate manner of supposed revelation and a rival product, so to speak. I hate to reduce it to that, but I have a hunch that's what's at the basis of it. And so there were some that were allowed, some that weren't. The idea of astrology being forbidden, again, you don't forbid what people are not doing already. And that certainly means that they're, like Isaiah said, should a people, well, I guess he said this about necromancy, the spirit mediums. Should a medium consult the dead on behalf of the living instead of consulting their gods? He says much the same about astrology. He doesn't want that, and that's because he's a prophet and deals in direct revelation from God, supposedly. Well, that implies that the people are doing this, right? It's not some weird custom they heard about on TV on some far-flung place, right? So you would have had others that disagreed with Isaiah in condemning astrology, and that's no surprise. And that survives even on into the Gospel of Matthew hundreds of years later, because he has no compunction about having the Magi from Parthia show up, because the stars have alerted them to the birth of the new king. That's okay with Matthew. So you just have different views colliding in the Bible. And as Kazemon pointed out so well in an epic-making essay some decades ago, the New Testament canon and the unity of the church, which turned out to be the disunity by the end of the essay. Okay. Let's see. Here's one in response to Jorby from episode 15-027, whatever that was. Have you heard of the new church down by the wharf? They hold worship services on Friday and public herrings on Wednesdays. This sounds like the Hall of Dagon at Innsmouth. People that I know who have attended services there have been impressed because there's a strong emphasis on the saving of souls, S-O-L-E-S. The only real mark against it that I know of is that the head friar recently quit. He admitted that he'd had his doubts for a while, but had stuck around for so long just for the halibut. which presumably was good enough for Jehovah. Yes, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd have to rate this church as an 8, ATE. Thank you, folks. I'll be selling CD carp dishes in the lobby at the end of the show. Thank you, Dr. Barton, comedian. Well, here's another one. When I heard someone on a podcast mention that L. Ron Hubbard, Scientology's Thetan, the alien race whose spirits cause negative emotions in humans or some such rot, there was an obvious corruption. The suggestion that Thetan was an obvious corruption of Satan. I suddenly realized that Hubbard may have been basing his Xenu and Thetans on Azazel or Semyaza and the Watchers from the first book of Enoch. Azazel and his Watchers come from the heavens. Xenu and his Thetans come from the heavens, outer space, the same thing in ancient thought, right? Azazel was captured and bound by his former colleagues, the archangels. Xenu was captured and bound by his former colleagues, the Galactic Federation. Can you believe Tom Cruise and these people believe all this? Azazel was imprisoned in a mountain. Xenu was imprisoned in a mountain. The Watchers were captured and imprisoned in a pit. At the judgment, they will be cast into a lake of fire. The Thetans were captured, admittedly, by Xenu, and imprisoned in volcanoes. These would appear to have been inactive because the Thetans weren't incinerated until Xenu set off hydrogen bombs in those volcanoes. The spirits of the children of the Watchers, the Nephilim killed by the flood, haunt the world as, for lack of a better term, demons. The disembodied Thetans, having been reprogrammed by Xenu, possess human bodies and cause negative emotions. There isn't a perfect match, and there are certainly enough common tropes in the story to make any connection certain without evidence from Hubbard himself, but it's enough to... There's certainly... I think you mean there's certainly not enough common tropes in the story as a whole to make any connection certain without evidence from Hubbard himself, but it's enough to make me suspect that First Enoch was a major influence on Hubbard's formation of his theology. Have you heard of this theory before? No, I haven't. Actually, that sounds very reasonable to me. I wouldn't be surprised. The Book of Enoch had certainly been available in translation, and you can well imagine that Hubbard, with his interests, would have read it. That makes sense to me. In fact, in some ways, that's less far from the myth of the Watchers than its depiction in the movie Noah. Very interesting. I wouldn't say it too loud, though, because you know those Scientologists are pretty unforgiving. Okay, that's a goodie. Here's another one. In listening to you speak of the story of Jesus healing a man's withered hand, Matthew 12, 9 through 13, I focused in on your offhand remark that Jesus' response utilized an unnecessary definite article, the equivalent to thee, with the word for hand. Stretch forth the hand. The story stated that Jesus healed it so that it resembled the man's other hand, but Jesus' healing powers had limits, and most of that was the power of exorcism. That got me thinking about an article I've gotten other inspirations from. R. Campbell Thompson's Assyrian Prescriptions for the Hand of a Ghost in the Journal of Royal Asiatic Society. The Journal of the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland. Number 4, October 1929, pages 801 to 823. In this article, it says the Assyrians believed that ghosts could lay hands on a person and afflict him medically. Perhaps the hand referred to here was not so much the man's physical hand, but the hand of a ghost afflicting the man's hand. In that case, Jesus was not performing a medical, in the modern sense, miracle, but exorcising a ghost. I don't get a clear sense of an exorcism in this passage, but my Greek is significantly less proficient than my mediocre Hebrew is, so I'll have to ask your opinion on the matter. Stretch forth the hand. Let's see. Could he mean cast off the hand? I sort of doubt that that would work in Greek, but let me take a fast look at this in Matthew 12. Okay. Let's see. Stretch out your hand. Okay, 13. Let's look up the Greek. Ektenon su ten hera. Kai exetenen. Okay, stretch forth or extend. That's the root of it. Extend your hand. And he extended. Yeah, I don't think that would work, because if it simply seems to mean extend, not cast out, and he, the man, extended it, and that seems to me not to comport with an exorcism. Interesting, though. This guy reads the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland from 1929. You see why I call him the erudite Dr. Barton. He says next, I was wondering what you might think about this observation. The story of Paul driving out a demon from the woman who followed him in Acts 16:16 came to my attention recently, and I looked at the Greek behind it to see if there was more to the story than I had thought. That indeed appeared to be the case. First of all, I noticed that the word for woman or damsel was paidiskin. What I don't think is normally mentioned here is that paidiska was a term used for boy or young man, used for divinatory purposes. I'm pretty sure this is a term used in several divination ceremonies described in the Greek magical papyri. This woman appears to have been the female version of the profession, since it, especially as it mentions that her lords got mad when Paul drove the power of divination out of her. Secondly, I noticed that the text uses the term pneuma, spirit, a rather neutral term that was used, I believe, for Christians possessed by the Spirit of God. It did associate her with Python, divination, a rather Greek form of divination, usually, I thought, by the priestesses of Apollo, but apparently applicable to other diviners as well. The passage did not seem to apply any particularly negative connotations to this woman. It even referred to her soothsaying as mantenuomai, from which we get mantic, I believe, which was also a term used for Paul and the other apostles on occasion. Third, this paidiskin acted much like demons in the other parts of the synoptics, proclaiming the sacred power of Paul or Jesus. I know who you are, Holy One of God. There was no implication that she was mocking Paul, only that she might have been bringing him a little more publicity than he cared for. The fact that her masters allowed her to follow Paul for many days implied something, though I'm not sure what. Perhaps the storyteller was implying that they were making money off of her being perceived as a follower of Paul and the public seeking her out for divinations when Paul wasn't available. Finally, when Paul had had enough, he commanded the spirit to leave the woman. It is worth noting that unlike in an analogous passage in Luke 8:29 with the demoniac, Paul did not command an unclean spirit, but simply a spirit. Thus, I have to conclude two things. This passage was structured as a kind of anti-parallel to the Gadarene demoniac of Luke. And two, this passage suggested that there were diviners not directly associated with Christianity that were nevertheless accepted as inferior but still speaking by the Spirit of God. Now I'm having to look at the other possession tales of the New Testament with an eye to the idea that they might not have all been tales of possession by demons, but sometimes tales of possessions by the Holy Spirit as well. Legitimate but perhaps a little awkward timing for Jesus and his followers. Also think of in 1 Corinthians where it says, the spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet, and God is not a God of chaos, but of order. So if anybody feels he has a revelation, let him wait till the first prophet finishes, and only then let him hold forth. So there's the idea that you could have several. I mean, what is the one single Holy Spirit going to start interrupting himself? And the spirit of a prophet almost implies some kind of familiar. So something odd's going on there that might be worth checking. Let me just say, I think that I view the Pythoness passage a bit differently. It seems to me that this combines a couple of different emphases and perhaps even a couple of different earlier versions of the story, or different stories, just like the deaf, mute, epileptic exorcism after the Transfiguration. That's obviously two stories sewn together. I think originally the point of Paul shutting the woman up, and now that may be Lucan redaction, actually. In fact, that would be the way I would think of this. I deal with this in the widow traditions in Luke Acts. The redactor who put together Luke Acts as we know it, and again, I think that was Polycarp, he didn't like women having roles of prophecy and teaching and things like that. Sometimes he didn't wind up suppressing that, because he does allow Priscilla to be an important teacher, but he comes right up to having. It's obvious that in the story of Philip's prophesying daughters, that story originally had them telling Paul that if he kept going toward Jerusalem, he was bound to be tied up with his girdle, or the prophet's girdle. Now that seems to parallel the testament of Job, where Job's group of daughters who were inspired and prophesied wore prophetic girdles, waistbands that were part of the garb of ancient prophetesses. And so it seems to me very clear that originally it was the prophesying virgin daughters of Philip that supposedly made this prediction about Paul, but not anymore, right? He grabs Agabus the prophet, who appeared about 10 chapters before, and sticks him in the story to give the oracle, because he doesn't want women to prophesy. And there's plenty of other signs of this kind of thing. If you read my favorite of my books, The Widow Traditions and Luke Acts, and what's going on here with this woman proclaiming the way of salvation, right? I mean, she's saying, listen to Paul. She's like John the Baptist with Jesus. These men are telling you the way to be saved. Will you shut up, lady? Why doesn't he want her to say that? Well, that I think is Lucan or Polycarpian redaction, because he doesn't think women should be preaching the gospel. I think that's the idea. Furthermore, I think that the point of the original story before he shut the woman up was that here is another instance of the thing we find. Is it in Titus? I forget. It's in one of the pastoral epistles. As one of their own poets has said, Cretans are lazy gluttons, always liars, etc., etc. As one of their own has said, right? Look, don't take it from me. Listen to them. It's not just my saying so. Listen to the heathen. They admit it. That's what the basis of the Jewish and Christian Sibylline oracles. Originally a pagan Sibyl, right? But they began to write Sibylline oracles that praised Christianity and Jesus and Judaism, and the idea was, you see, it's not just us. Other prophetic people can see that we're right. So I think that's I've not found such faith even in Israel. It's that kind of thing that. And I think that was the idea that, and she wasn't silenced originally, I think. I got another theory about that the prophetess, the Pythoness, was actually the same character as Lydia in the same story, but that's today's podcast of the Barton Geek. I think that's all from the good doctor today. Looking forward to more. Here's another one from Caleb. There's a great name and a great biblical name. I was raised in the worldwide Church of God until my teenage years, Armstrongism. Around that time, the church had started transitioning to the more mainstream evangelical style church it is now, in the form of Grace Ministries International. Between the significant doctrinal changes announced by the church and several scandals that had occurred among the church leadership, my family slowly grew disenchanted with the Worldwide Church of God. We initially attended a couple of services at United Church of God, one of the many Armstrongist splinter groups, but that didn't stick. While we weren't very keen on the new direction Worldwide was headed in, we were too disenchanted with the old style of Armstrongism to go back to it. Most of my family ended up attending various non-denominational Protestant churches and continue to do so on an irregular basis to this day. As for me, I was mostly just happy to be allowed to watch TV on Saturday, and wouldn't have preferred to go to, and would have preferred to go to no church at all. I slowly became agnostic about religion in general, and I think most of my family did as well, though they would never admit it. However, one of my brothers responded to the change in Worldwide by becoming even more devout. After his own strange spiritual journey, he now works for a company called Christian Fellowship Publishers, which publish the translated works of Watchman Nee, as well as works by other Christian authors such as Stephen Kong, Kaung. Now on, that is really, really fascinating. There's a slight cultic element to Watchman Nee, and especially to his protege Witness Lee, but Nee is justly famous among fundamentalists. I would say if you want to get an idea of what fundamentalist spirituality is about, and in our day you'd almost forget that there was a fundamentalist spirituality, because so much attention has gone into social issues and inerrancy and second coming nonsense that people almost have forgotten that there even was one. Well, you ought to read The Normal Christian Life by Watchman Nee, which is really quite profound, and of course it only makes sense within the fundamentalist language game, right? But it really is a superb example of fundamentalism at its best, I think. Okay, anyway, now on to my questions, Caleb says, which are somewhat related to this story. One, I really enjoy your seemingly encyclopedic knowledge of different Christian sects. Almost no one I meet has ever heard of Armstrongism. Boy, that's surprising. But I've heard you talk about it in some detail. Do you know anything about, do you know anything about Watchman Nee and his present-day following? Sorry, I jumped the gun here. I can't find out much about it online, but from my conversations with my brother and the little bit of Nee's work that I've read, I would describe the beliefs as similar to the Brethren movement. You mean Plymouth Brethren? Because I would say that's probably so in terms of the spirituality, but I don't know enough to really determine whether this is the case. The Witness Lee movement is called the local church, and I can't really remember why now, but when I was in the evangelical subculture, I used to hear people refer to it as kind of a weird mutation of Watchman Nee, and I don't know what the problem was, and even this was decades ago, so I don't really know where they're at now, but I hope for the sake of the fundamentalists they're still publishing Nee's books. Witness Lee with an L, but Watchman Nee, or Ni Do Shang in Chinese. His book, The Normal Christian Life. He's written a bunch of other ones too, but that's the one I would point the curious to. Two, speaking of the Brethren, when I used to participate in Bible studies with my brother, he generally consulted two translations, the Revised Standard Version and John Nelson Darby's translation. I know you hold the RSV in fairly high regard, but what do you think of the Darby translation? I've used it some and thought that it read like an attempt to raise accuracy of the translation above mere readability, but again, I don't know enough to determine how accurate the translation is. Do you know of any ways that this translation might have been skewed by Darby's beliefs? Well, I just happen to have here a discussion of Darby's translation, and it's in one of the most fascinating books I've read, Herbert Dennett's, D-E-N-N-E-T-T, A Guide to Modern Versions of the New Testament. It was published by Moody Press years ago. Let's see, when did this thing come out? 1965. I don't know if it's been reprinted. I'm sure you could find it on ABE Books or something. It is just fascinating. Dennett is, I'm sure, a fundamentalist himself, but I don't think that makes any difference for a thing like this. And in fact, it's a help because he doesn't let anybody get away with anything. He's a very astute and insightful critic in the good and bad sense of various New Testament translations. If you're a nut on translations and different versions, you ought to try to find this book, especially since a lot of the translations that he discusses you never see anymore. This was before all. I think the newest translation he deals with is the New American Standard, if I even remember right, and he does that. But here's what he says. The New Testament, a new translation by J.N. Darby. If there were not the revised version of 1881 to recommend so strongly, then the older version of J.N. Darby might well take its place for the careful student of Scripture. This is in spite of the fact that it is a one-man work and open to the objections to such. Darby translated the Scriptures into French and German as well as into English. In the preface to his German work, there is a note which is equally true of his English translation. Quote, "The purpose," here's a Church of Ireland minister at first, "the purpose is not to offer a man of letters a learned work, but rather to provide the simple and unlearned reader with as exact a translation as possible. This is a decidedly literal translation, though not to the same extent as Young's and Rotherham's. Darby does not carry his policy of following the original to extremes or offer renderings which are almost unintelligible, as some very recent versions do. He also brings out much better than most literal versions the real character of the New Testament scene. The version is, however, not always easy reading, but the treatment of synonyms, whether you're going to tenses of verbs and of the definite article is generally good. Here and there the style is inclined to be heavy, as in 2 Timothy 4:7. I have combated the good combat. On the other hand, the literal be it not so of Romans 3:4 in some versions is more happily rendered, far be the thought. I think it's me genoito, may it never be, literally. The curious expression, wicked men and juggling impostors, is found in 2 Timothy 3:13. The regular use of bondman is certainly better than the authorized King James Version's servant, but it lacks the force of the plain slave. Almost every one-man version bears some mark of personal bias, and this one does in 2 Timothy 2:21. If therefore one shall have purified himself from these, in separating himself from them, he shall be a vessel unto honor. The sense of the middle phrase can be had only by taking the word sanctified out of its normal context and applying it in a special way. This is pure exclusivism. So he's saying there, separating himself from them. That's brethren exclusivism. They're the open brethren and the closed brethren. And the closed brethren would not let you take communion with them unless you could bring a character reference letter from somebody in another brethren chapel that these people knew. And because they wanted to make sure you didn't eat and drink unto your own judgment. So it does show up there, but that's pretty minor. Let's see anything else about that now. Let's see. So he likes the version. It's literal, probably pretty darn good, and I should get a copy of that. I once had one, but I should take a look for another one. Yeah. Darby, of course, was the creator of dispensational theology, which is quite fascinating. Now here we go with interesting translations and sectarian Bibles. Again, this is, I love stuff like this. Kevin Smithy says, in episode 35 of the Human Bible podcast, you received an interesting question which you addressed in the segment, Is That in the Bible?, which I quote below. Is it true the Bible says women can achieve salvation by having babies? In your answer, you discuss the relevant passage in 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15, which says, to quote the new RSV, or you mean the PC RSV, let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, then Steve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. No, my use of the Apostle Paul Lynn's voice does not imply that I accept the Pauline authorship of 1 Timothy, but then I don't accept the Pauline authorship of any of the Pauline epistles. Okay. The key verse is 15, where it says that the woman is saved through childbearing, and most translations read similarly. You discussed a couple of ways of understanding this, including one essay by Dr. Aida Spencer, which interpreted the aforementioned childbearing as the birth of Christ from the Virgin Mary. I wanted to point out another interpretation which immediately leaped to mind. This one has been rather cleverly encoded in the rendering of this verse in the Jehovah's Witnesses New World Translation. However, she will be kept safe through the childbearing, provided she continues in faith and love and sanctification, along with soundness of mind. That's the 2013 edition of the New World Translation. The older 1984 edition reads similarly. To say that a woman will be kept safe through childbearing changes the entire meaning into something more mundane than saved. The New World Translation is the only one I've noticed that does this. The New American Standard uses the term preserved. I think in both cases the motivation for these renderings is clear, to steer clear from the sense of salvation proper, and to imply that these qualities, faith, love, holiness, modesty, will no doubt ensure a safe pregnancy. While this interpretation still seems open to some uncomfortable questions, such as, what does this mean for women who have suffered miscarriages? Apparently the translators felt that it was better than implying that women could achieve salvation by having babies. I wonder what your thoughts are on the matter. Well, I think Dr. Spencer's view is really far-fetched and implausible. But it almost sounds like Catholic Marian devotion. The childbirth, the big one, folks, Jesus from the Virgin Mary. This one is not out of the question, even though it's no less superstitious and magical, right? If a woman is pious, she will get through childbirth okay. Why would that be? It seems to be a kind of a oversimplified karmic thing, where instead of going to your Lamaze classes, you go to Bible studies and stuff, and it's just superstition. But it's not But we shouldn't be too surprised to find that in early Christianity. But beyond that, think of what the Genesis 3 story says about childbirth. That Eve and all women henceforth will have pain-bearing children because of Eve's role in helping alienate Adam from God. And this would make some sense if that were in view. So that's not absurd. It's not as far-fetched as I think Ida Spencer's view is. Though, maybe she could argue me out of it. Maybe I'm missing something about it. But it does seem to me that they're saying that women will be saved via childbirth. And now, how would that save you, even if you wanted to take it that way? The way of salvation for women is to have babies. My guess is that there too we're just trying to say she should. It's like saying that women should be barefoot and pregnant. It's this chauvinism of Polycarp, who I think is the author of the Pastorals. If not 1 Timothy, still that's based on the Pastorals and must have been written by a disciple of Polycarp. The idea that they should just stick to the kitchen, etc., and they'll be saved if they do that, because if they don't, they're going to veer off into heresy. And again, what about the adjacent Adam and Eve stuff, right? Certainly this writer is viewing that story as the fall into sin and damnation. So with reference to that, the two theories almost mean the same thing. Whether be saved or kept safe, either way, they're slightly different. Both would seem to hark back to the Eden story, and the difference would be, what do you mean, kept safe through delivery, or you won't be damned if you stick to the domestic role of women, which is also sort of stipulated in Genesis 3. Okay, one more from the great David Oliver Smith, author of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul Lind. He says, I was pondering the messianic secret in Mark and noticed that Mark's Jesus tells demons and unclean spirits who recognize, hey, that would make sense. Suddenly, the light dawns. The Gerasene demoniac, he sends the unclean spirits into the pigs who rush into the water. Maybe they're sick of being unclean. Notice that Mark's Jesus tells demons and unclean spirits who recognize him as the Son of God to keep silent. In the case of the Gerasene demoniac, he kills them. Dead demons tell no tales. In a couple of cases, Jairus' daughter and the deaf mute, Jesus tells them, it's not clear who that is in either case, not to mention the healing. There is also the case of the epileptic who is possessed by a mute spirit, but Jesus doesn't need to tell it to keep quiet because it's already mute. In the other healing, Jesus doesn't mention keeping quiet. In some cases, he tells the healed person to show it off. Right? Go to the priests and get certified that you're okay to circulate in society again. It seems to me that Mark is reflecting 1 Corinthians 2:7-8, where Paul writes, But we speak of God's wisdom in a mystery, even the wisdom that hath been hidden, which God foreordained before the worlds unto our glory, which none of the rulers of this world hath known. For had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. That is, Mark's Jesus doesn't want the rulers to know who the heck he is. If they knew he was the Son of God, they would not crucify him, and God's plan would be spoiled. From a mythicist point of view, it's especially significant that Jesus mostly tells demons and unclean spirits to be silent so that the archons in heaven won't find out. That's where the real crucifixion of God's Son took place, according to mythicism. What thinketh the geek? What saith the geek? Well, your theory, though a good one, does presuppose a division between demons and archons that I'm not sure obtains. Now, the way both are generally described in the biblical and adjacent mythology does seem to leave some space between them. A demon is this pesky ghost who possesses people. The principalities and powers, the elemental spirits, the archons don't seem to be on that kind of crummy, slovenly level. Right there, it's like the demons are like pickpockets and muggers, whereas the rulers of this age, the archons, are like the head of multinational corporations and countries and stuff. And in fact, they were like the powers behind the throne, according to ancient belief. Which goes way back to Deuteronomy, right? The sons of God, each of whom ruled a particular nation. But so depending on this, like if there's much of a distinction, you got a real good point that he wants to keep it away from the archons. But then you've got to ask the question we dealt with a couple of days ago on the Bible Geek as to whether Satan understood what would happen or not if Jesus went to the cross, because Mark and Matthew seem to think that that Satan knows what will happen, and therefore, through Peter, is urging him to skip the cross. God forbid, Lord, this must never happen to you. Out of my sight, Satan! Whereas because he knows his goose is cooked if Jesus is crucified and saves the world and so on. But in Luke and John, he apparently does not know, because he's the one that engineers Judas betraying Jesus to his enemies. And he's pretty surprised, presumably, by what the heck happens. He is an archon, right? And John calls him the archon of this age, or this world, I guess. If Satan is an archon, there appears to be a difference of opinion as to whether he knew about the significance of the crucifixion or not. Presumably in Matthew, Mark he does not, and that would fit the statement of 1 Corinthians, right? The rulers of this age had no idea what they were doing by engineering the crucifixion of the Christ, right? They signed their own death warrants by doing that, so that would fit. And it's also important to ask, again from the other day, whether 1 Corinthians is saying they didn't recognize Jesus, or that they did, and that's why they wanted to be rid of him, but they didn't realize what would happen, that they were playing right into God's hands. So I'm just thinking out loud here, but your theory does make sense. But I get the impression the silencing of the demons in context in those Markan passages is that he doesn't want the humans on the scene to hear it and know it. That's also why, presumably, he tells these people to not tell anybody about the healing. And I'm not even sure if the go tell the priest is an exception to that, since that's really evidence for the reader that Jesus has healed them. That if they go to the priest will verify it. That's the issue in James Randi and others criticizing faith healers today. Did you really get certified as sick to begin with and then healed afterward? No, I didn't think so. And I think that's kind of going on there. For the ex-leper to be able to go to the priest and be certified. Well, I don't know how you did it, but you're clean of leprosy. Welcome back. Here's a handshake. That would be like the demons rushing over the cliff into the water and dying. Well, I guess he wasn't just talking when he said, get out of the demons. I guess, it really happened. So I think the same thing is going on there. I'm an old-time Vreda follower on the Messianic Secret. I think that often it's been added to the story, even in context where it makes no narrative sense, just to try to cleverly but clumsily reinforce the idea, well, yeah, Jesus was the Messiah from the baptism on, and therefore couldn't help showing it all over the place. But then, how come some people say he only became the Messiah as of the resurrection? What big news could that be if you already had all these miracles? Hey, this guy must be the Messiah. Well, let's suppose he did all the stuff that should have tipped them off, and would have, had he not kept it under his turban and told them to. I do think that's a good one. Plus, you'd have to ask, why would the demons, Screw Tape and Wormwood and these guys, why would they not simply be able to communicate to the archons what they knew, right? Why does them enunciating it aloud in a synagogue change anything? So I'm a little suspicious of that, but who knows? You may be right. Keep up the good work, Dave. Okay, here's one more from Mark. In your June 11th podcast, you offered a quotation from Francis Schaeffer, which reminded me of the philosophical position of igtheism or ignosticism. If I understand it correctly, igtheism, I never heard of this, is a refusal to engage in the debate over the existence of a god, or gods perhaps, because if such a being or energy exists, it is beyond human understanding. Being beyond human understanding, the nature and existence of God cannot be debated. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on igtheism/ignosticism. I see in it great potential for extracting oneself from the loop of illogic that often results from ontological debate. So if there were a God, he could not be known. This does sound like kind of a correlate, if that's the word, of apophatic, negative theology, as is practiced in the Eastern Church and in Buddhism, right? The notion that if God is what we say he is, namely eternal, infinite, absolute, words that are just metaphors anyway, the human mind could never grasp him. Because even, they have to put the word him under erasure, as Derrida would say, because it's just too mind-blowing. It would have to be. If you had a God you could understand, you got yourself an idol. It'd be ridiculous. If a punk like me could understand God, it ain't much of a God. Right, so any God worthy of the name could never be discerned, really, much less debated. Oh, you're worried that you don't see signs of God? Oh, he didn't stop that bus from running that guy over. What, like in Job, do you think you know enough to hold God to account? You're an idiot. Of course not. That's pretty interesting. It sort of reminds me how Paul Tillich said it's blasphemy to assert that God even exists, because God being itself is beyond existence, and the only thing we can actually say that is literally true of God is being itself. That sounds pretty good to me if I'm understanding it right. And this is why I say that most atheists really are agnostics, but not quite in the Huxley sense, or even in the William James sense, in that most atheists feel like, look, I am in no position to know whether or not there is a God, obviously, but I just don't see enough reason to take the idea seriously. I don't know that they're not centaurs living underground on the moon. I mean, but what reason is there to think so? And that, I think, is the usual atheist position, technically agnosticism, but why bother? And this is, in some ways, like that. Yeah, it could be so. But I suppose the question is being begged of idealist metaphysics. If you don't find that compelling, the idea that there are somehow spiritual entities that are non-material and more real than matter, like if that doesn't make any sense to you, and it doesn't to me, then the question doesn't really come up. You wouldn't even take the idea that there might be an unknown God seriously. Those are my random, chaotic thoughts on the matter, I suppose. A very interesting question. Thanks. I'm sort of on a roll here. I want to keep going. David C. says, the very early Christian doctrine that sins could not be forgiven after baptism washed your soul clean. Constantine is said to have delayed his baptism until his deathbed for this very reason. A lot of people did. Raises interesting questions. Was this idea prevalent only among Orthodox Catholics, or was it more widespread? What would Gnostics, Marcion, or Paul have thought? Is there any hint of it in the New Testament? Might it have predated Christianity, perhaps among the baptizing Jews who rejected the temple cult? Well, in a weird way, yes, because they practiced hamarobaptism, or daily baptism. So it wouldn't have been a once-and-for-all thing, so you better delay it as long as you can. The bar for what constituted a sin couldn't have been too low, otherwise 5 minutes after emerging from the purifying river, you might absent-mindedly ogle someone else's spouse, and thus, by Sermon on the Mount standards, already have nullified the work of the Savior. I'd be interested in a brief history, if it be known, of how the one slip up and you're damned again, this time for real, thing got started, and how it loosened up later on. Well, we do know that the Marcionites had the same notion, that they said, look, you'd better, if you are baptized, that's going to mean a pretty strict life, and you can just attend the Marcionite synagogue, which is what they called them, and delay baptism. It was sort of a Mahayana Theravada difference. You can come to the meetings and believe our doctrine, but maybe you better wait a while. Well, you know what Billy Graham says. You might get hit by a missile from a flying saucer tonight on your way home from the crusade, so get it settled now. I don't know what they did with that, but there were a lot of Christians, apparently of different stripes, who took this approach. Look, I can't afford to fool around. Think of what one of the pastorals has Paul say. You know, I'm very careful where I step, because I don't want to, after having converted so many others, wind up losing out myself. That's nascent Catholicism for you, to use Casamon's word. I think you do find this in the Epistle to the Hebrews. It says, if we sin after we have been enlightened and tasted of the good things of the age to come, you better forget it, because in order to save you again, Christ would have to die again, and he ain't going to do it. Don't be like Esau, who sold his birthright for one single meal, right? And so forth. I get the impression that this is because of eschatology, right? It also says now you can surely hold out just a little longer, because it's not going to be long before he comes in judgment, and so on. I get the feeling that the sense that is the notion, that you can live a sanctified life, at least until then. Now, when it becomes, I think also 2 Clement says something about about preserving the seal of baptism by not sinning, because if you did, you'd be up the creek, up the lake of fire, I guess. The Shepherd of Hermas, written I think in 2 stages, a few decades apart at the end of the 1st century and beginning of the 2nd, that has the angel of repentance show up to Hermas, a local church leader, and he tells him everybody is worried about sin, and rightly so, and I've appeared to you, Hermas, to give the church a revelation through you. I want you to tell him that God is allowing one further repentance. I call it a second repentance. But after that, you're on your own. And, of course, this also has to do with the soon coming end of the world. Hermas sees a vision of the Great Tribulation as sort of a Toho Studios monster barreling down the road and so forth. There's a very interesting parallel to that in Sikh literature, and also in a Twilight Zone episode. But that implies that, the longer time went on, the more worried people got, because they couldn't, even on a pretty low standard, I'm imagining, could not continue to believe they hadn't sinned. Now, one thing that happens when that occurs is libertinism, right? Gnosticism and its antinomianism fits into that. You can say, well, what if what I am doing isn't a sin? Oh, I don't know, maybe because the old laws pertain to the world of the demiurge and were imposed by angels and archons. So I can defy them and do what I want. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, as a later Gnostic, Aleister Crowley, said. And so that's one way of dealing with it, because you just can't. I mean, if you take this seriously enough to be a pious Christian, and you suddenly think, oh, just don't say I'm damned for all time, like Judas. You got to come up with some way of trying to regain peace of mind. Well, history went on, in case you haven't looked at the calendar lately, and what they did was to say at some point you can sin in such a way as to cancel your baptism. That'd be a mortal sin or a fatal sin, or whatever you want to call it. And you certainly have that in 1 John, right? If somebody sees his brother sinning, let him pray for him. Of course, I don't mean if you've seen him commit a mortal sin. There's mortal and there's not mortal. I'm not saying you should pray for somebody that's done a mortal sin or sin unto death, same thing, right? But apparently, because you'd just be wasting your breath. That's interesting. So you say, okay, there are some sins that would be deadly, but not all of them. So you're softening the thing up. I see the same sort of thing involved in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount. Anyone who is angry with his brother has already committed murder. What? Well, oddly enough, in later manuscripts, it says, anyone who is angry with his brother without cause has committed murder. If somebody figured, look, I can't stop being angry at Fred over there. He's pretty annoying. And so, well, maybe this is what they meant. And they begin to mitigate it, right? And so it's the same sort of a thing. Okay, there's sins and then there's sins. As my old pal at Brookdale Baptist once said in Sunday school, when they asked, does anybody know the two categories of sin according to Catholics? And he said, yeah, mortal and venereal. Well, what's the venereal sins? Maybe they're not so bad. And that evolves into the sacrament of penance, right? Where, okay, you're sinning all the time. You might even commit mortal sins pretty frequently. But we got to deal with that some way. So, okay, how about this? If you die without having repented and confessed of a mortal sin, you go into hell. But you could confess it and be forgiven, right? If you intend to change your ways. I don't think that's in harmony with 1 John or with the Epistle to the Hebrews, right? And with venial sins, lesser, petty sins, if you die with those unconfessed, okay, you go into the big steam bath, you go into purgatory, but you'll get out of there and wind up going to heaven. There's this hilarious scene in The Sopranos, which Carol and I are watching yet again in the summer, where Christopher has been almost fatally shot, and he dies on the operating table for about a minute, and when they resuscitate him, he's talking to Paulie, and he says, I was in hell. I saw my father there, and the bouncer there told me that when I came back, I'd be there forever. And Paulie is saying, no, did any of these people have horns on their heads? And he's, well, no. And he says, well, you was it very hot? And he's, well, not that I remember. Okay, you didn't go to hell. You went to purgatory. And he says to him that purgatory is temporary. Of course, that is the idea. And he says that... and he's mitigating as he goes along. He says that you take your mortal sins and multiply the number of them by 50, and you take your venial sins and you multiply them by 25, and then you add them all up, and that's the amount of time you're going to spend in purgatory. I mean, this verges on Father Guido Sarducci's 35-cent sins that mount up, and so on. Well, Paulie, just one second here. Sorry, I had to pause for a phone call, another one of those darn creditors. So if you can help out the Bible Geek, I'd appreciate it. Anyhow, so Paulie's mitigating as he goes along, and he says that for himself, he figures he's probably got a term of about 8,000 years in purgatory, but that in the perspective of eternity, that's not much. It's probably just like a couple of days here. Where the heck would he have gotten these ideas? Well, of course, the theology of mitigation, and you can't really believe it's going to be that tough, right? And so I think, yeah, that's what happened and how we got to the sacrament of penance, where you have to be repeatedly forgiven because they know you're going to sin. I mean, just like God says after the flood, gee, I guess I kind of flew off the handle there. I shouldn't kid myself. Imagination and thoughts of the heart of man are unceasingly evil. That's not going to change, so etc., etc. Well, if you think it's going to change, you're kidding yourself, and you're headed for mischief, right? Because you're going to just say, well, if I'm doing it, it can't be sin. If the Holy Spirit has sanctified me, it might look like sin, but it ain't. Great. Okay. Okay, yeah, here's a topical one. Wait a second, who is this? This one from... Oh, yeah. Not Martin Luther says, knowing your conservative bent, admittedly a direction in which I do not lean, combined with your understanding of religion, of religious people and practice, and your reasoned approach in general, I wanted to ask you a question related to this morning's U.S. Supreme Court decision requiring all of the states to perform and recognize gay marriages. My question is, what are your thoughts on the associated fears many well-meaning conservative people who don't accept gay marriage or relationships on religious grounds have that the government will force them to act contrary to their religious beliefs? The question is of interest to me as I have a brother who is a very conservative Lutheran pastor. While we don't share political or religious beliefs, we talk about both all the time. It's amazing what actual respectful dialogue can do to prevent demonization of the other. He and his synods... Oh, I got another way of avoiding it, by the way, is just not to talk about these issues. I get tired of the kabuki dance. You know what everybody's going to say and in what order and all that. But you're on a higher plane than I am there. Okay. He and his synods officials have always had some preliminary discussions about possible ramifications. Do they have to give spousal benefits to a gay employee of the synod should the issue arise? Will they be asked or required to perform such weddings? I doubt that one. Knowing my brother, I don't doubt the sincere beliefs and concerns of these good people. But during the civil rights legislation era, for example, mightn't the sincere beliefs of otherwise good people have included that, for example, people of different races should not mix, or that black people were inferior to white? Virtually no one today believes those people should have been allowed to deny service to racially mixed couples or to members of other races. Please offer your opinions weighing the rights of marriage equality or other seemingly similar issues such as contraception coverage under the Health Care Act with the rights of exercise of religious convictions. I think there is like a kind of a Gordian knot of issues that have been confused together. I think that the court should not have decided this either way. I think it should have been decided legislatively in the state by state. Now, I have nothing against gay marriage, so I don't regret that it's now legal, right? Different issues here. But I think that what they did was to usurp the power and authority of the national and the state legislatures, who apparently are only too happy to yield it up in many cases, to pass the buck. I think that this and the Obamacare decision the day or so before are instances of the court legislating, much as the current president does on certain things, with executive orders beyond any reasonable limitation, seems to me. I didn't like what Nixon did either, right? This is not partisan, in my opinion. It's how things are being done that worries me quite a bit in cases like this. I don't think that you're going to have ministers and priests and rabbis forced to conduct weddings. but it's not out of the realm of possibility because of what I was having a discussion with a friend the other night about one of these awful political topics I'd prefer to avoid, about doctors and other medical personnel who refuse to participate in abortions. And that my friend was saying, if I understood him right, well, like in the Super Chicken song, you knew the job was dangerous when you took it. You don't have any right to withhold this service that someone asks for. If you thought that you might be asked to assist in an abortion and you wouldn't want to do it, you should have become a plumber instead. That kind of thinking, which I believe is not unique to my friend, is the same sort of thing that might very easily lead to somebody saying, hey, you wanted the job of marrying people, and since we're not going to discriminate, you mustn't either. I don't care what you think. And what they might do to put the pressure on is to say that, okay, your church is no longer tax exempt. Remember when the Mormons would not allow black folk to become members of the Melchizedek priesthood, which is just a lay priesthood sort of a thing, because there's something in the Book of Mormon, and the government said, well, you can do that, but you're going to lose your denomination's tax-exempt status. And they had a revelation saying, well, God says, I guess it's okay. It's about time to allow blacks into the Melchizedek priesthood. How convenient. I don't think that the government has the right to do that. I think that would be limiting the free exercise of religion when you say, my conscience forbids me to be involved in this, declaring a holy union of matrimony between two people of the same sex. Where I come from, we don't believe that was it. God, from the beginning, God made them male and female, and for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and stick with his wife, and so on. I think that though, again, right, I don't care. In fact, I think there would be no controversy over this if people could do what I and my family did many years ago, when we went to have dinner with a gay couple, the one man being an old dear friend of mine, and he and his partner showed us this unbelievably cute little baby they had adopted from Bolivia, I think, and they were about to adopt another one. I thought, if anybody could see Hunter and Robert here, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference between Ward and June Cleaver. I mean, it was obvious to me that these guys weren't some sort of weirdo degenerates, which is a gross, offensive stereotype for gays, period, anyway. But I guess that's what people are afraid of, right? And I said, there wouldn't be a debate over this if you could just encounter people. That's very often the case, right, in all walks of life. So it's fine with me. But I can't just be so impatient. Well, get with the program or get out of here. I don't think the government has the right to do it, and I do think that would be tantamount to what's going on. We're going to put the pressure on you. We're going to put the screws to you until you do what we want you to do. I think the thing with slavery, that was a teensy bit different, because we're talking about something that very obviously affects people in a subordinate position, to put it mildly, right? You could have an opinion that it's okay with the Bible for you to own slaves, but that is harming someone who doesn't think so, and you don't have the right to do that. This is like us outlawing certain types of drug use or violent tactics on the part of some extreme religious groups, not many, luckily. I know your religion mandates that, but we just can't allow that. We can't have you doing these things. I'm sorry, there's a limit to this, just as this is the limit to free speech. You can't yell fire in a theater if there isn't a fire, right? I think the issue comes up also with abortion, right? The idea that, in fact, though anti-abortionists are often religious, and that's a weird way to say it, they think their religion is the origin of the ban on abortion that they'd like to see. To me, it has nothing whatever to do with religion or the Bible. It's a philosophical matter, and that's why I am against abortion. And the way I view it is, like you mentioned, the slavery thing. You can say, well, I don't happen to believe it, but others do. Would you have said that about slavery? If you really think, as I do, that it is snuffing out an innocent human life, then you really are obliged to be against it. But there again, there's at least a pretty good chance that your free decision is unfairly costing another individual their life. I don't see anything like that happening in gay marriage. I don't see a victim there. So my problem with it is simply that the Supreme Court once again usurped prerogatives of other branches of government, not that gay marriage should not be legitimated. I just think, in fact, I think Charles Krauthammer was saying this the other night too, that this was unnecessary to do because public opinion has so rapidly changed on this issue that the outcome would have been inevitable eventually anyhow, without the Supreme Court sticking their 9 noses in it. It's really a generational issue, and it's not going to be long before even Republicans and evangelicals and all that in the next generation are going to be amazed anybody ever was against it. Okay, the contraception coverage, I think that was unfair also. That it seemed to me pretty straightforward, and please do not write in about this. I'm only answering a question. I'm not trying to pontificate, but it seems to me that that one was kind of roughshod, in that nobody was saying contraception shouldn't be covered. What was it, Chick-fil-A? They were happy to cover 7 of 9 of the stipulated birth control methods, but a couple of them that seemed to be abortifacient. I have no idea about the science of this, but they understood it that way, and so they said, look, we can't be party to this. You have freedom of action, but so do we. We're not going to sell out our convictions just because it'd be more convenient and so forth. So, yeah, I think that they're overstepping their bounds there. Yeah, what a mess. Right? I went into simple stuff like biblical criticism. My poor brain is not smart enough to deal with questions of medical ethics and the like. Ooh, well, I'm in a mood to keep going. Roman Montero says, I'm probably not your average listener. I'm a very conservative Christian, although not that orthodox, as I'm a Jehovah's Witness. But I like hearing different viewpoints from people more skeptical, like you and Bart Ehrman, and on the other side, from people like Craig Evans or James White. I discovered you through a debate you had with James White. Let me just pause and say I commend you strongly, Roman. That's really good. I think people should consider all the options. Okay. Anyway, my question is about the passages in Acts 2 and 4 where it seems like the Christians in Jerusalem were practicing a kind of communal property and redistribution. What exactly is going on here? Was this a temporary measure? Was it just in Jerusalem? 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 13 seems to suggest that at least in Thessalonica, the communal system was still in place and some people were taking advantage of it. Or am I reading that wrong? Very interesting. Got to return to that. Let me just pause there. There are two leading theories about who the moochers were, who the people that would not work were in Thessalonica. And both of them are pretty good. One is that some people were practicing an interim ethic, just as Jesus told these followers to give up their jobs and so on and just work for the kingdom of God in the limited time remaining. These people figured, what's the point? If Christ is coming back so soon, it just seems like a total waste of time to engage in mundane pursuits. And if everybody thought that way, you probably would have a communal situation. But apparently they just were mooching off the people that didn't look at it quite that way. But what's the big deal? It can't be long now anyhow. And the other theory is that, I guess the response to that would be, well, you got to behave as if this is going to be your last day, but also that it's not, right? You got to be ready to meet your maker at a moment's notice, but you got to be carrying out your responsibilities. You want to be caught doing that, right? Justin Martyr or somebody gives us a saying of Jesus, not in the Gospels. In whatever I find you doing, in that will I judge you. Yeah, right. Well, you better be doing your regular stuff, so that would have been the answer to that one, right? You can't just mooch. The other one might be that you're dealing with wandering prophets and apostles, the charismatic itinerates of the early church, and like the prophet Agabus and people like that. Or the brethren in 3 John and such. These we're told in the Didache that if a prophet comes and let him speak at your meeting and all that, and feed him and put him up for 3 days. But if he wants to stay longer than that, tell him to get a job, because they were already having problems with people just being circuit riding parasites. The Jesus movement had that in the late 60s, early 70s. Gospel bums, they called them, who would go around from commune to commune and just stay as long as they could mooching. And so this may mean that. It may refer to those people. I mean, both views are quite possible, and neither one would necessarily imply that they still had a kind of communism in Thessalonica, but they sure did in Jerusalem, right? Okay, going on with Roman. Also, I assume that you would say that the book of Acts is not really to be considered historical. Do you think the passages in question are historical, or do they serve some other kind of, or do they serve some kind of ideological function? If the latter, what do you think it was? Was the writer trying to propose a different social system, or just play out the consequences of Christian ethics, or what? Let's see. There are a number of Hellenistic references to an imagined golden age where you had, well, like Marx said, primitive communism, that people shared everything they had, and if you couldn't make a whole lot for the community, but you were in severe need, the community would cover that. Well, a lot of people thought that like it was a golden age paradise in the beginning, and of course that would be used as a yardstick to highlight the inequities of the present time. Well, those descriptions look so much like the brief description in Acts that Henkin, for instance, in his commentary, says this seems to be one of them, that this is proposing an ideal, let's get back to the garden, though probably it never actually happened that way. There's a book called The Myth of Christian Origins, Myth of Christian Beginnings. I can't think of the author. Robert Wilkin, I believe it is, that talks about this, the ideological usefulness, and that you find origin myths like this for various religious communities. However, let's look at it this way. It may be, as I think F.C. Bauer suggested, that what we're reading there does reflect the arrangements in some Christian communities, but they've been retrojected into the dawn of the church, along with the order of widows that is mentioned in the same framework. That is otherwise attested in the 2nd century. And, of course, it looks to a lot of us like Acts was written in the 2nd century. And just sort of assuming that the way things were in the writer's day reflected the practice of the earliest church. It's not, and this would be the same sort of a thing, perhaps a monastic community, like the 12 guys in Acts 19 that have been followers of the Baptist. It's not like you couldn't have had this in early Christian times, because the community at Qumran, or whoever wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they certainly give out the rules for a communal existence of apocalyptically minded pious Jews. And I mean, very much like the book of Acts, even down to the point of having a council of 12 and an inner circle of 3 and so forth. The question is, though, that was we don't know how early that would have gone back into the origin of the Qumran community. And so it's hard to know what stage of their development that represents. And you wonder if Christianity right off the bat would have entered into a communal arrangement. They might have. I mean, they would have known about the Qumran sect in all probability, so they could have just said, well, that's the way to go, and did it immediately. Could be. But it kind of looks to me like it's a golden age myth. Now, if it were true, though, if it were factual, that would sure go a long way to, and it might be, right? That would go a long way to explaining why the Jerusalem church, who call themselves the poor, and so did the Qumran community, by the way, why James and the others would ask Paul in return for their rubber stamp on his apostolic work to take up a collection among his much bigger fan base, his constituency among the Gentiles, to be relief for the needs of the poor in Jerusalem. If they had pooled all their resources, what did Margaret Thatcher say? The problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money, and yeah, that's so. That would fit hand in glove with that piece of data about the collection for Jerusalem. Let me see. Outside of widows' houses and stuff like that, I'm not sure you would ever have seen an early Christianity that as a whole was communal like that. And finally, Romans says, I've always thought that Christians should, at least in principle, be opposed to capitalism as an ideology based on these verses. The anti-wealth attitude in the New Testament and the anti-usury sentiment that Jesus seems to uphold from the Hebrew Scriptures, and his mission statement in Luke 4:18 through 19, referring to the Jubilee, come to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, in his sayings about lending, as well as the pro-poor attitudes and anti-greed attitudes all throughout the Bible. You could say that, as a lot of them did, that there are wealthy capitalist philanthropists. Even the Koch brothers, whom Democrats, or at least Harry Reid, so despise. These guys are supporters of gay marriage. They've given huge amounts of money to finding a cure for AIDS. They're big givers, just like in the old days. I'm not sure that's not what was going on in the New Testament. Even with Jesus and his disciples, right? When he says, sell your possessions and give to the poor, who does he mean? Who's the poor? I think it's himself and his disciples. And because it's like we're told eventually that these wealthy women followed Jesus around and paid for the bills of his disciples, and Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and so forth. Mark and Luke both mention that. So I'm not sure that the New Testament pattern is not giving us, again, a Mahayana Theravada approach. In Theravada Buddhism, just to stick with that for the moment, they realize that it's only a tiny minority who will become celibate monks and nuns, and who devote their time to meditation and so forth, and who kind of go trick-or-treating door to door. And the bourgeois Buddhists are happy to give them food every day because this is good karma. They know they're not going to nirvana, the state of nirvana, when they die, because they'd have to, really get down to business like the monks are. But they're not. They're pious but worldly, and so they figure, I can use the boost to at least get a better incarnation next time. So let me accrue the good karma for helping out these guys that are really buckling down. I feel sure this is what's in view in the Gospels, where if somebody gives you a cup of cold water because you bear the name of Christ, he will not lose his reward. Whoever helps a righteous man gets a righteous man's reward. That's, I think, exactly what's going on in Buddhism and in the Gospels there. So I think if you look close, and I would recommend my two chapters, the Hinayana Gospel and the Mahayana Gospel, in my book, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man. I think you might find that interesting. Let's see. Also, a paper I did recently at the Johnny Coleman Seminary Colloquium, The Austerity Gospel of Gordon Fee, who's a revered teacher of mine at Gordon Conwell. That's going to be published shortly in the New Thought Scholar. Eventually, maybe I'll post it or something online, and because that deals with this sort of Christian socialism idea. Paul Tillich wrote a book, Christian. It was advocating Christian socialism. It was called The Socialist Decision. That might be interesting to read. Okay. Well, okay, I guess that's... wait a minute here. How much more do I have? I mean, I'd have that long... Yeah, I think I will close shop for today. I'm getting a little bushed here. I appreciate, as always, your listening to the Old Geek. It's very gratifying to be able to put all this info I've soaked up over the decades to some kind of decent use. So I much appreciate it, much gratified about your interest in the podcast, and keep on sending those always amazingly good questions, and I'll answer some more of them next time on The Bible Geek. Hello, it's Robert M. Price, The Bible Geek, with a special episode called The Barton Geek, because, as you know, our good friend Dr. Barton, pseudonym though he is, frequently shares interesting hypotheses and readings and conjectures with us, and I, for one, am always happy to steal his stuff and put my name on it. Well, not quite. I do actually give him credit. But since I happen to have a whole bunch of them, I figured if we can have the Reuven Geek, we can have the Barton Geek. So, on the way with the Barton Geek, though before I forget to mention it again, I did want to remind you to tune in to Gary Stevens' podcast, The History in the Bible, which has to do with what leads into the radical criticism, aka minimalism, of the Old Testament